I've always known my place in the family. Jason was the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, and I was, at best, the silly little sister, at worst, an afterthought. No matter what I did, my parents never seemed to see me as capable of anything serious. It didn't matter that I had my own career, my own financial independence. To them, I would always be secondary to Jason. And Jason? He knew it too. He basked in the favoritism, wore it like a second skin, and wielded it like a weapon. Our grandfather built the family business from the ground up, pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into making it something that would last for generations. It wasn't just a company. It was a legacy, something that was supposed to secure our family's future. When he passed, my father took over, maintaining its success. And then, when the time came for the next generation to step up, there was never a question of who would inherit it. Jason was the obvious choice, the son, the heir. I don't even think my name was mentioned in the conversation. At first, things seemed fine. The transition was smooth, and Jason put on a good show of being a competent businessman. But I knew my brother. I knew how he handled money, how he didn't handle money. He had always been reckless, spending without thought, assuming there would always be more. I watched, helpless, as the business started to crumble under his control. The warning signs were everywhere. Clients started pulling out. Investors became skittish. The company's name, once respected, became a whisper behind closed doors, people wondering how long it would last before it collapsed completely. But my parents, they refused to see it. Every time I tried to bring it up, I was met with the same dismissive tone. "Oh, Amanda, you don't understand business like Jason does. Your brother is handling things. Don't worry yourself with it." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab them by the shoulders and shake them, force them to open their eyes. Jason was bleeding the company dry. He was throwing money at pointless projects, trusting the wrong people, making terrible deals. But none of it mattered because, in their eyes, Jason was incapable of failure. Then the debt started piling up. It was no longer just whispers or speculation. It was real, tangible damage. Suppliers weren't getting paid on time. Employees started missing paychecks. There were rumors that the company was close to defaulting on loans. And still, my parents denied there was a problem. "Jason will turn it around," my father insisted. My mother, ever the devoted protector of her son, would shake her head and say, "These things happen in business. He'll figure it out." But he wasn't figuring it out. He was making it worse. Then came the final straw. One night, I got a call from an old friend, someone who used to work closely with my grandfather. He sounded tense, almost panicked. "Amanda, you need to do something," he said. "Jason is about to sign a deal that could sink the company for good." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of deal?" He hesitated. "It's a merger with a group that has a terrible reputation. They've been involved in fraud, lawsuits, everything you can think of. If this goes through, it's going to bury what's left of your grandfather's company." I knew Jason. He wouldn't listen to reason. He wouldn't care about the consequences, not if he thought it would get him fast money. I hung up the phone and drove straight to my parents' house. They were in the middle of dinner, sitting in their pristine dining room, acting as if everything was fine. Jason was there too, looking smug as ever, sipping wine like he didn't have a single worry in the world. I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" I demanded, slamming my hands on the table. Jason blinked at me, looking genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "The merger," I snapped. "You're selling out to criminals." His expression darkened, but before he could respond, my father sighed, already exasperated. "Amanda, you don't know what you're talking about." I laughed bitterly. "I do, actually. Unlike you, I actually checked into them. You're letting Jason make deals with people who will gut this company and leave you with nothing." Jason rolled his eyes. "You're being dramatic. You're being an idiot," I shot back. My mother gasped. "Amanda, apologize to your brother." I stared at her, incredulous. "Are you serious? He's ruining everything, and you're still defending him." Jason stood up, pushing his chair back. "You don't get it, Amanda. This isn't some little project you can nitpick at. This is real business. The kind of business you wouldn't understand." I clenched my fists. "I understand plenty. I understand that you're sinking our grandfather's legacy because you don't know how to do anything except spend money you don't have." He scoffed, turning to my parents. "Are you going to let her talk to me like this?" My father looked at me, disappointment clear in his eyes. "Amanda, maybe it's time you left this to the people who actually know what they're doing." I could barely believe what I was hearing. Even now, with all the evidence in front of them, they still refused to see Jason for what he was. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Fine," I said. "If you won't listen to me, maybe you'll listen when it's too late." Then I turned to Jason. "But when this all comes crashing down, don't come looking for me to fix it." I walked out, slamming the door behind me. And for the first time in my life, I hoped everything would burn. I always knew my parents favored Jason, but I never realized just how deep their devotion to him went, until I found out they had rewritten their will. I learned about it by accident. An old family friend, Richard Langley, a retired lawyer who had once advised my grandfather, called me one evening. His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure if he should even be telling me this. "Amanda, I need to ask you something," he said. "Did your parents discuss any recent changes to their estate with you?" I frowned. "No, why?" There was a long pause. Then, in a voice laced with regret, he said, I shouldn't be telling you this, but they've changed everything. The entire estate, the house, the assets, and even whatever's left of the business. It's all going to Jason. You've been written out completely. I felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs. What? I saw the paperwork myself, he continued. They updated it about 6 months ago. I thought you should know. 6 months ago. That was around the time the business had started visibly declining. I should have felt hurt. I should have felt betrayed. But honestly, I wasn't even surprised. They had always put Jason first. Always. I was just the afterthought, the unnecessary extra, the one they barely even considered family unless they needed me for something. And as it turned out, they were about to need me. Because Jason was running out of money. Fast. The company was bleeding. Investors had pulled out. Debts had swallowed whatever reserves were left. And suddenly, after years of dismissing me, my parents were acting unusually nice. It started with small comments. We're so proud of your independence, Amanda. You've always been so responsible with money. Then came the heavier hints. Jason's had a rough time with the business lately. It's not his fault, you know. The economy is unpredictable. And finally, the outright requests. We were wondering, my mother said over dinner one night, carefully stirring her tea, if you might be willing to help out, just a little. I let my fork clatter onto my plate. Help out. Jason, sitting across from me, barely even looked up from his phone. He was completely unbothered, like none of this concerned him. Well, my father said, clearing his throat, your brother has done everything he can, but the company is struggling with some temporary cash flow issues. If we could just borrow. I almost laughed. Temporary? The company was on its last legs, and Jason was still living like he had an endless supply of money. I took a slow sip of my wine and forced a confused expression onto my face. I don't know much about business, though. Are you sure I'd even understand what's needed? My mother smiled, relief washing over her features. Oh, of course. That's why Jason will guide you through it. Jason finally looked up, smirking like he knew he had one. Yeah, Mandy. You just need to provide the funds. I'll take care of the complicated stuff. I nearly crushed the stem of my wine glass in my hand. He had no idea that I was onto him. I nodded slowly. I guess that makes sense. If I'm going to help, I'd probably need to see the financial records, though. Just to know what I'm getting into. Jason rolled his eyes. Fine. I'll have my assistant send you the reports. He was so arrogant. So sure that I was still the naive little sister who didn't understand how the world worked. The next morning, I received the documents. I spent hours going through them, combing through every line, and what I found made my blood run cold. The company wasn't just struggling. It was drowning. There were unpaid loans totaling millions. Multiple lawsuits from former business partners and clients who claimed Jason had either breached contracts or straight up defrauded them. Fines from regulatory agencies for financial mismanagement. And, worst of all, several transactions that looked suspiciously like embezzlement. Jason hadn't just run the company into the ground. He had been actively stealing from it. I needed proof. Real proof. I made a call to one of my old university classmates, Liam Carter, who now worked as a forensic accountant. I told him I needed help analyzing financial documents, and he agreed to meet me the next day. When we met at a quiet cafe downtown, I slid the files across the table. He flipped through them, his brows furrowing deeper with every page. After about 20 minutes, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. Wow, your brother's in deep. Tell me everything. Liam tapped one of the pages. See these transfers? Large sums moved to offshore accounts under shell companies. That's money laundering. I clenched my fists. And here, he continued, he's been falsifying revenue reports to make the company seem more profitable than it actually is. That's fraud. I swallowed hard. How bad is it? Liam exhaled. If this goes public, Jason could face serious legal consequences. Jail time. I sat there for a moment, absorbing it all. I had suspected Jason was reckless. But this? This was criminal. And my parents were covering for him. They had to know, at least on some level. Maybe not the full extent, but enough. Enough to rewrite their will, enough to try and manipulate me into giving them money to clean up Jason's mess. I closed the folder and met Liam's gaze. I need more evidence. Something undeniable. Liam nodded. I can dig deeper, trace the offshore accounts, maybe even find out who's on the other end of these transactions. Do it. As I left the cafe, my mind was racing. Jason thought I was playing his game. He thought I was naive, easy to manipulate. But he had no idea that I had just declared war. I knew Jason would never willingly give up control of the company. He was too arrogant, too convinced of his own invincibility. But what he didn't realize was that I had leverage. The financial records Liam uncovered were damning, but they weren't enough, not yet. If I exposed him outright, he would find a way to spin it, and my parents would throw every last cent they had into protecting him. No, I needed to be smarter. I needed to take the company from the inside. Jason had majority control of the company, but it was still technically a publicly traded business, which meant that there were shareholders, investors who, unlike my parents, actually cared about their money. I started small, using legal loopholes and silent partners to begin buying up shares without drawing attention to myself. I worked closely with a financial strategist, Daniel Carter, Liam's older brother, who specialized in corporate acquisitions and knew exactly how to maneuver within the system. through multiple entities. We steadily increased our holdings without raising alarms, ensuring that Jason remained completely unaware of what was happening. At the same time, I started reaching out to key investors, particularly those who had already expressed concerns about the company's declining performance. I positioned myself as a concerned party, someone who wanted to help Jason stabilize things without outright criticizing him, carefully planting enough doubt so that when the time came, they would be willing to listen to me. Jason's financial situation was worsening by the day. The company was bleeding out, the debts were suffocating, and the once loyal investors had started to lose faith. Desperate for cash, he began reaching out to anyone who might be willing to invest, but the problem was that no one trusted him anymore. That's when I made my move. I approached him in his office, a sleek glass-walled space that overlooked the city skyline, a physical representation of the power he believed he still had. He looked exhausted, the stress of his crumbling empire starting to show, but even in his desperation, his arrogance remained intact. "I have a proposition," I said, setting a thick file down on his desk and meeting his gaze with a calm expression. Jason smirked, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on him. "Oh? Little Amanda wants to play business," he drawled, his voice laced with condescension. I refused to take the bait, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm willing to invest a substantial amount into the company, enough to cover the immediate debts and restore confidence among the investors." His smirk faltered for just a moment before he quickly masked it with skepticism. "And why would you do that?" I shrugged, pretending as if this was nothing more than a business decision. "Because, like you, I care about our family's legacy." He studied me for a long moment, tapping his fingers against the desk as he considered his options. "What's the catch?" I allowed myself a small, knowing smile before delivering the final blow. "A controlling stake." The smirk disappeared completely as his entire body stiffened, his expression turning cold. "Absolutely not." I expected that reaction, which is why I didn't even flinch. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice unwavering. "Jason, you don't have a choice. You need this money. No bank will touch you, no investor trusts you, and every avenue you've tried has led to a dead end. I am your only option." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I had never seen before in my brother: fear. "You think Mom and Dad will let you do this?" He scoffed, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. I tilted my head slightly, studying him. "Mom and Dad don't own enough shares to stop me," I said, watching as the reality of the situation finally began to sink in. He tried to fight it, of course. He stalled for 2 days, trying to find another way out, but in the end, he had no choice but to sign the deal. The moment the ink dried, I wasted no time initiating the next phase of my plan. I ordered a full forensic audit of the company's finances, and though Jason raged and protested, there was nothing he could do to stop me. Liam and his team combed through every record, every hidden account, every suspicious transaction, and what they uncovered was even worse than I had anticipated. Jason hadn't just mismanaged the company, he had actively stolen from it. There were millions funneled into offshore accounts under fake business names, falsified revenue reports designed to mislead investors, and direct theft of company funds hidden under the guise of consulting fees. There were also multiple legal infractions, some of which carried serious criminal penalties. The moment I had everything I needed, I called for an emergency shareholder meeting, ensuring that every major investor, board member, and legal representative would be in attendance. Jason walked into the boardroom with his usual bravado, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He knew I had something, but he had no idea just how bad it was. My parents were also present, sitting near the back, their expressions confused and wary, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I stood at the head of the table, taking a moment to look at each person in the room before I began. "I'll keep this brief," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "As you all know, the company has been struggling financially, but what you don't know is why." I clicked a remote, and the large screen behind me lit up with the first slide of the audit report. Jason has been engaging in financial misconduct for years. Fraud, embezzlement, and gross mismanagement have driven this company to the brink of collapse. A heavy silence filled the room, followed by murmurs of shock and anger. Jason shot to his feet, his face twisted in rage. "This is a lie." I didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, I continued flipping through pages of evidence, detailing every fraudulent transaction, every hidden offshore account, and every falsified document. These records show undeniable proof that company funds were stolen, investors were misled, and financial reports were falsified to cover up the massive losses. This company is not just struggling, it is bankrupt. The room erupted in gasps, and I saw the color drain from my father's face as my mother covered her mouth with a shaking hand. Jason slammed his fist on the table. "You set me up." I turned to him with an icy calm. "No, Jason. You set yourself up." And then I delivered the final blow. As of today, I am officially moving to remove Jason from his position as CEO. Effective immediately. He lunged across the table, his face red with fury. "You can't do this." But security was already waiting, grabbing him before he could reach me. "I own controlling shares, Jason," I said coolly. "I can, and I just did." The fallout was immediate and brutal. Investors pulled out entirely, the company's stock plummeted, and the bank, realizing the company was unsalvageable, began the process of seizing assets, including my parents' home, which they had used as collateral for one of Jason's reckless loans. My father called me that night, his voice shaking with barely contained rage as he demanded to know how I could betray my own family, but I simply laughed bitterly, telling him that they had done this to themselves by blindly protecting Jason while he destroyed everything. My mother, desperate and pleading, begged me to fix things, to make it right, but I had no sympathy left to give. I had fought my entire life to be seen, to be heard, to be taken seriously, and now, for the first time, I had done what none of them ever believed I was capable of. I had won. The moment Jason was dragged out of the boardroom, screaming threats and curses, I knew there was no coming back for him, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of finality, as if the power dynamics that had ruled my family for so long had shifted permanently. His time as the untouchable golden boy was over, and the consequences of his reckless greed had finally caught up with him. But I also knew that Jason was not the type to go down quietly, and true to form, he lashed out in every way he could, desperate to salvage what little remained of his crumbling empire. In the weeks following his removal, the full extent of his destruction became clear as the company, which had already been on life support, completely collapsed under the weight of his financial crimes. And as the forensic audit findings circulated among shareholders, investors, and the media, there was no longer any way to hide the truth about what he had done. His personal finances, which had been so deeply entangled with company money, were in absolute shambles, and without the steady flow of stolen funds keeping him afloat, his lavish lifestyle unraveled almost overnight, leaving him scrambling to pay even the most basic of expenses. First, the investors who had once lined up to work with him distanced themselves completely, pulling out of deals, terminating contracts, and ensuring that Jason's name was permanently tarnished in the business world. And then the lawsuits began rolling in. Former business partners, defrauded clients, employees who had gone unpaid for months, and even regulatory agencies seeking damages for financial violations he had committed in his desperate attempts to keep the company's failure hidden. The banks, which had been hesitant to act as long as Jason held onto some semblance of power, saw an opportunity to recover their losses and wasted no time in doing so, seizing corporate assets one by one as the company defaulted on loans that Jason had foolishly taken out in a last-ditch effort to keep everything from imploding. Within a matter of months, the business that my grandfather had spent his entire life building had been reduced to nothing but a shell of lawsuits, unpaid debts, and a disgraced former CEO whose name had become synonymous with greed, incompetence, and outright fraud. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Jason refused to take responsibility for anything, convincing himself that he was the victim in all of this, and in his mind, I was the one who had destroyed his life, not his own reckless actions, not his arrogance, and certainly not the years of corruption and mismanagement that had led to this inevitable conclusion. And so, instead of facing reality, he did what he had always done whenever he found himself in trouble. He tried to manipulate the system to bail him out, but this time, he had no allies, no resources, and no one left to shield him from the consequences of his own mistakes. One morning, I arrived at my office to find a thick envelope sitting on my desk, delivered through a legal courier service, and the moment I saw Jason's name on the return address, I already knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside, there was an official lawsuit, filled with baseless accusations claiming that I had sabotaged the company, defamed him, and wrongfully removed him from his position as CEO, and if I hadn't been so used to his delusions, I might have actually been surprised by the sheer audacity of it. Instead, I simply handed the documents over to my attorney, Evelyn Hart, a ruthless corporate lawyer with a reputation for dismantling men like Jason with surgical precision, and as she flipped through the pages, her expression shifted from mild amusement to absolute disdain. "This is laughable," she said, shaking her head as she tossed the papers onto my desk. "Half of these claims contradict each other, and the other half are so vague that they wouldn't hold up in court for 5 minutes. He doesn't have a case, and judging by the sloppy filing, he doesn't even have a competent lawyer." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms as I let out a small sigh, because as ridiculous as Jason's attempt was, I also knew that it was going to be a drawn-out process, and if there was one thing he excelled at, it was wasting everyone's time in a futile attempt to avoid responsibility. "So what's our next move?" I asked, already knowing that Evelyn would have a plan in place before I even finished speaking. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent shivers down a person's spine if they were unfortunate enough to be sitting on the other side of a courtroom. "We countersue for damages and legal fees," she said simply. "Then we bury him in motions until he drowns." And that was exactly what we did. The case dragged on for months, but Jason never stood a chance, because without money, without connections, and without a single piece of evidence to support his claims, he was doomed from the start, and every time his lawyer tried to present an argument, Evelyn tore it apart with ease, methodically dismantling every accusation until there was nothing left. Eventually, the judge dismissed the case entirely, ruling that Jason's lawsuit was not only baseless, but also a deliberate attempt to harass me through legal means, and as an added humiliation, he was ordered to pay my legal fees, which, of course, he couldn't afford. The lawsuit didn't just fail. It accelerated his downfall, because the moment it became public knowledge that he had tried and failed to sue me, the media latched onto it, turning him into an even bigger spectacle than he already was, and soon, headlines across every major business news outlet painted him as a disgraced fraudster desperately grasping at straws after losing everything. While Jason's life disintegrated, my parents suffered their own downfall, but instead of acknowledging reality and admitting that their blind favoritism had led to this, they clung even harder to the delusion that Jason was the victim, refusing to accept that he had destroyed everything with his own hands. They had put everything they had into the company, investing their life savings, mortgaging their house, and trusting Jason to make decisions that would secure their future. But when the bank finally seized the last of their assets, including their home, they had nowhere left to turn. My mother called me in a panic one evening, her voice shaking as she left a voicemail begging for my help, telling me that they had lost the house and had nowhere to go, pleading with me to call her back. But I never did, because I had already taken care of everything before they even realized what was happening. Months before the foreclosure process was finalized, I had anticipated that their home would go up for auction, and I had quietly arranged for one of Daniel Carter's associates to purchase it on my behalf, ensuring that on paper, it appeared to be an unrelated buyer swooping in at the last moment. By the time my parents fully understood what had happened, it was already too late, and the eviction notice arrived, forcing them to pack up what little they had left as the life they had built around Jason crumbled entirely. I was there when they left, standing across the street as they loaded their belongings into an old sedan, and though my father refused to look at me, his pride too shattered to acknowledge my presence, my mother wasn't able to hold back her desperation as she approached me with tears streaming down her face. "Amanda, please," she sobbed, gripping my hands as if I was her last lifeline. "We need somewhere to stay. Just for a little while, just until we figure things out." I pulled my hands away, my face expressionless as I stared at her, feeling nothing but a quiet sense of finality. "There's nothing I can do," I said calmly, and when she blinked at me in disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that I was refusing to help them, I tilted my head slightly and asked, "Like how you helped me when you rewrote your will to give Jason everything?" Her face crumpled with shame, but she still couldn't bring herself to admit that she had been wrong. Because even now, even after losing everything, she still refused to see me as anything other than second to Jason. I turned away before she could say anything else, walking into the house that was now mine, closing the door behind me, and leaving them standing outside with nowhere to go. Because in the end, I had taken back everything they had stolen from me, and I had done it without ever giving them the chance to stop me. Rebuilding the company was harder than I expected, but I had no intention of letting my grandfather's legacy die in the wreckage Jason had left behind. After removing Jason and severing all ties with my parents, I took full control, but what I inherited wasn't a business. It was a disaster. The corporate offices had been gutted. Key employees had either quit or been fired by Jason for questioning his decisions, and our reputation in the industry was practically non-existent. The first few months were nothing but damage control, putting out fires that Jason had set, meeting with furious investors, and renegotiating contracts that had been broken under his leadership. I assembled a new team, hiring back some of the people Jason had wrongfully dismissed and bringing in fresh talent from outside the company. One of my first hires was Lauren Mitchell, a sharp, no-nonsense operations manager with a background in corporate restructuring. She had spent years turning around failing companies, and when I laid out the full extent of the damage, she didn't even blink. "I've seen worse," she said simply, rolling up her sleeves. I doubted that, but I appreciated her confidence. Daniel Carter, the financial strategist who had helped me quietly buy shares and gain control, remained on board as my financial advisor, and with his help, I implemented a strict plan to restore profitability. We cut all unnecessary expenditures, liquidated failing assets, and focused on securing new investors who had been wary of dealing with Jason but were willing to take a chance on me. The biggest challenge was repairing our public image, as Jason's scandals had left a permanent stain on the company's name. I worked closely with a PR expert, Evelyn Clark, a former journalist who had built a reputation for handling corporate crises, and she developed a strategy that positioned the company as moving in a bold new direction, while subtly distancing me from Jason's failures. It took nearly 2 years, but the turnaround was undeniable. Profits stabilized, clients returned, and for the first time in over a decade, the company was back on solid ground. I didn't just rebuild it, I made it stronger than it had ever been under Jason's leadership, and when we finally reported our first year of solid profits, the industry took notice. Meanwhile, Jason was floundering. He refused to accept his downfall, convinced that if he could just find the right opportunity, he could reclaim everything he had lost. At first, he tried to launch a new business venture, announcing on social media that he was back and better than ever, but no serious investors would touch him. His reputation was toxic, and everyone knew his track record. When that failed, he turned to smaller projects, desperate to find anything that would put him back in the spotlight, but one after another, they crashed and burned. The lowest point came when he started a GoFundMe campaign, claiming that he was working on a groundbreaking new business idea that would revolutionize the industry. He made dramatic videos talking about how he had been betrayed, and how he just needed one more chance to prove himself. At first, a handful of people, mostly his remaining enablers and a few clueless sympathizers, donated small amounts, but it wasn't nearly enough to fund anything significant. The campaign stalled at a few $1,000s, nowhere close to the amount he had hoped for, and instead of inspiring confidence, it became a joke. A well-known business commentator made a scathing video mocking Jason's GoFundMe, calling it the most pathetic attempt at a comeback in corporate history, and within days, it went viral. Suddenly, Jason wasn't just a failed businessman, he was a meme. People started dissecting his failures, making parody videos mimicking his dramatic pleas for money, and digging up every embarrassing interview he had ever given. Every time he tried to respond, he made it worse, lashing out online and blaming haters and jealous losers for his misfortune. The more he fought, the harder he fell, and within a few months, he had completely faded into irrelevance. My parents, meanwhile, had finally begun to understand what they had done. At first, They clung to their delusions, convinced that Jason would somehow turn everything around, but as the reality of his failures became undeniable, their faith in him wavered. They had lost everything. Jason had cost them their home, their savings, and their status, and now, for the first time in their lives, they were facing the consequences of their blind devotion to him. They moved into a small apartment, far from the social circles they once thrived in, and while they still defended Jason publicly, I knew that deep down, they had finally begun to regret their choices. One evening, I received an email from my mother. "Amanda, I know we've made mistakes. I know we didn't treat you the way you deserved, and I'm sorry. Your father and I were wrong about Jason. We see that now. We should have supported you. Please, can we meet?" I stared at the email for a long time before closing it without replying. A few weeks later, I ran into my father by chance. I was coming out of a business meeting at one of the high-end restaurants downtown when I saw him walking down the street, his shoulders hunched, his expression tired and worn. He looked nothing like the proud, imposing man I had grown up fearing. He looked smaller, older, defeated. For a moment, he hesitated when he saw me, his face flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, shame, maybe even hope, but I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I didn't give him the moment of recognition he was silently pleading for. I simply walked past him, stepping into my car and driving away. Because I